are live. So thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by a very special guest who's no stranger to the Jude 3 Project, Dr. Dennis Edwards. Welcome, Dr. Edwards.
Hi, thanks. It's good to be back with you, Lisa.
I'm glad to have you back. We had you on to talk about coming from oneness to Trinitarian viewpoint. And for those who don't know, you, in addition to being a pastor, you are also a New Testament professor. You have your PhD in biblical studies and with a focus on New Testament. Is that correct?
That's right.
Correct.
Exactly
Okay.
right. Yep.
And I don't want to tell too much of your bio. I'll let you tell it because I know you know it better than I. For those who didn't watch the first episode you were on, could you just give them a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a New Yorker who now lives in Minneapolis. I serve a church called the Sanctuary Covenant Church. But briefly, I grew in my faith during my college years, and after a call to ministry, I did a Master of Divinity degree at Trinity Seminary. Oh, my undergrad was in chemical engineering from Cornell.
Oh, wow.
And then I did it. Yeah, kind of not doing much engineering. Well, in a manner of speaking, I kind of engineer in different ways now. But after my MDiv, I was a church planter in New York for a while, served some churches in Washington, D.C., including one I planted. And then while in D.C., I did an MA and PhD in biblical studies at the Catholic University of America. Over the years, I've taught adjunct for different places, particularly Bethel Seminary, especially when they had an extension called Seminary of the East. And now, since I'm in the Twin Cities, I teach at the St. Paul campus, and I've taught other places as well. But that's basically it. I'm married and got 4 adult children.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So today we want to talk about the dating and authorship of New Testament writings. This is really, as I was telling you before, this is really a passion of mine because until we kind of have some kind of common thought about, or some kind of, how do I want to say it? Dr. Howard John Wesley said it like this: if we can't agree on 2 + 2 being 4, we can never talk about calculus. And he said that in reference to understanding the scriptures. And if we can't agree that the Bible is authoritative, we can never go on to talk about issues in the scripture. So this is important to me because my first New Testament course, we had Bart Ehrman, because I took New Testament at a state university. So you're going to get a more liberal perspective. And Bart Ehrman is one of the leading New Testament scholars in the liberal circles. And so the dating and authorship and all that stuff was a real struggle for me. And when the foundation of scripture was really rocked for me, I had really trouble navigating through my faith because that's the foundation, the Bible. And so I definitely want to talk about it on here. And I thought you would be one of the people that can help us with that. Because I know it's been a long journey for me. That was back in 2007 when I first was exposed to that. And so I've had to wrestle through reading and thinking through that. So I was like, I should help other people that might be wrestling with it too. So
I appreciate that. That's good.
So depending on who you ask, the dating of New Testament writings may vary. What's the general dating of New Testament writings, and why is it important?
Yeah, a very fair question. I mean, part of the issue is, of course, what materials we have, right? We don't have original autographs by these authors. We've got a manuscript tradition, and dating is notoriously difficult. So dating is often done by the internal evidence, right? What the letters say about themselves, say about the time, what references they might make to historical events, how they communicate, how they communicate in the sense of the actual language, words. I mean, that's an issue for Old Testament writings as well as New Testament writings. Generally, we see the earliest letter thought to be from I guess I should say this too, that the tradition that we've gotten from the church through Papias, recorded by Eusebius, who is 3rd century, we have at least the historical tradition related to the writing. So that has to be factored in as well too. Is what have we gained from the church tradition? So all of that is a factor. Also, the tradition tells us around that pretty strongly that that Peter and Paul were martyred hand. So that would put a terminus, an end date somewhere around the mid 60s in terms of when they could have been writing. So that and then we've got the fall of Jerusalem in 70. So there are these historical times that we try to connect the writings to. So generally speaking, then Paul's letters would have to be dated before the mid 60s, and the Gospels, because they seem to touch on the fall of Jerusalem, are usually dated around 70, somewhere around 70. So that's generally the sense. Then you would have writings that seem to be addressing heresies that were starting to creep into the church. So that means the church has been around long enough for some other ideas to start to emerge. Some kind of incipient Gnosticism, for example, that starts to creep in. So you have writings that seem to deal with that, and if that's the case, then like toward the end of the first century, because that's when these heresies were thought to be on the scene, or at least starting to be on the scene. So we have a range from, let's say, the 40s, sometime after Paul's conversion, to the 90s, let's say, before the end of the first century, with the letters of Paul being earlier, Gospels being around 70, and then some of the other letters, the general epistles, being later, and Revelation being later. So that's a quick assessment of the landscape.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important, because one of the things that you see when you talk to different scholars with different viewpoints, the dating is important, because if we can date some of the Gospels or the letters later than the actual authors were there, then that becomes a problem, because it's like, who wrote this, and can we trust who wrote it, and are they making up or adding to stories they heard? So if in fact Paul didn't write this letter and somebody later wrote it and they attributed it to Paul, how can we trust the authenticity of that letter?
That's often the challenge, and that is one part of the question. I guess I would say to it though that it was, I trust my forebears in that in the formation of the canon, they wrestled with issues related to how the writings we have reflect the actual beliefs and practice of the church,
Mm-hmm.
as well as their connection to the apostles. And the fact of the matter is, we have some writings that we don't know who wrote them. Now, it's different to have a name of someone on there and it not be that, and then claim that it not be written by that person.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Second Peter, and we can come back to that as we need to. But it's quite another thing. We have the book of Hebrews, and we don't know who wrote it, yet we rely on that book.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly in the case of the Old Testament, we have several writings that we don't know who wrote them, see them as authoritative. So part of the issue is understanding what's maybe meant by the canon in terms of its authority, and then how much do we need to have? How important is it that we know the author? So I think one of the questions you bring up though is his name on it, and then folks claiming that it wasn't written by that person. That's the trickier part in my view. So it's not to me that I don't know who wrote something. It's more the question of, is it the person whose name is on the book?
Mm-hmm.
In the case of the Gospels, there are no names on the Gospels. That's from a tradition. That Matthew the tax collector wrote Matthew. For some people, it really is. For others, it's not that important. The question would be, what is he communicating?
Mm-hmm.
So I put that out there for folks to think about. So it is important that we trust the reliability of the works, and that may touch on authorship. I'll put it like that.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point you made. And one of the things we that I always am really passionate about, and I think we kind of connect on that, is that depending on which schools you're trained in, your thoughts about authorship and dating is going to be completely different. So, from my experience, my first interaction with the dating was Bart Ehrman. So that was extremely more so liberal late dating of the text in a lot of instances,
Yeah.
and kind of, really thinking through whether Paul wrote some of these letters. So, and then I went to a more conservative, which is Liberty. And so I found myself in the middle because I feel like that's the most intellectually honest position. And so as you're working through it on an apologetic level, it's kind of you have to like work through the nuances, and I think that we both agree on that.
Yeah, well, that's true, and I appreciate you saying that. And part of it, yes, has to do with where I was trained. But even when I was trained for my MDiv at a pretty conservative place, Trinity, we were at least exposed to notions of what's known as pseudepigrapha. And just to explain that term, it's the idea that uh, it's not quite plagiarism. It's the idea that someone wrote on with another person's name, and while that happened outside of religious circles, at least outside of Christian circles, we know it's debated if that happened within Christian circles. But that idea of writing in the name of your mentor, writing in the name of the person who, that was a practice outside, at least of Christianity, we know. So when I was trained at Trinity, that we were taught that. So we knew that there were some issues of authorship, and I was exposed to that. When I was at Catholic doing my PhD, I was there too. But admittedly, some folks had a stronger line on it. One of my revered professors, Raymond Collins, is entitled "The Seven Letters Paul Did Not Write." So he's pretty straightforward in of seven New Testament letters. Now, apart from Hebrews, that would leave six. Because I think evangelicals would even question whether Paul wrote Hebrews, but that still leaves six that he is pretty sure Paul didn't write, even though his name's on them. So I would say that yes, I was exposed to those ideas in both settings, and given evidence. Yeah. So I do see myself as a person, especially with my engineering degree, who looks at the evidence and considers that. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's important. It's funny because as you're saying that, at Liberty we were exposed to both views, but when I was at University of North Florida, we were only exposed to one view, and it was as if that nothing else existed. Like this was the solid data. So at the more conservative place, I got both. At the state university, I only got, so it was only on my own studies before I went to get my MDiv that I had to kind of open myself up to that. And so it's funny how sometimes what the people that claim to be open-minded kind of have limited the perspective in that regard.
Oh, interesting.
What do we know about, and I'm reading here for those who are looking, what do we know about the letters the early church accepted and rejected? What do we know about which letters the early church accepted and rejected?
Let me mention some good resources, and I'll try to answer that. There's a couple of good resources just to start out by that talk about the canon. Bruce Metzger, the book is called "The Canon of the New Testament," where he explains that in detail, and that's a little bit. Actually, I have it sitting right here. Sorry, I have it sitting right here. The other is also by a late scholar, F.F. Bruce, and it's a small book. It's quite accessible. It's called "The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable?" And that both of those works get at the question of the canon, which is really what you're asking. But so early on, to form, starting to hold on to writings. We know this even from Second Peter, where he refers to the writings of Paul. So at some point in the church's development, we know that they were collecting these writings. We know that they were sharing them, like at the end of Colossians, where it says, "Read the letter I sent to the Laodiceans, and make sure that they read this one." So we know that writings were shared and that they were starting to get collected. And sometime, well, as time went on, the church was needing to decide which writings communicated the history and I'm sorry, the let's say the doctrines that they held on to historically. And because there were more writings that were starting to creep in that didn't reflect what we might call Orthodox faith, why the councils started to emerge, and that's why they had to make decisions, and eventually came up with the 27 books that we have. But some were disputed along the way. There were people who had some theological perspectives that didn't think certain books should be part, like Marcion. He wanted to keep out certain books. He had more Gnostic views, so he wanted to keep out certain books. So the church debated this for some time. So I think that's kind of what you're getting at in your question.
Yeah. It's funny because the first time I was exposed to like, the thoughts about Marcion and, having some books accepted and some books, there was a point Bart Ehrman tries to highlight the Pauline epistles and the authorship of the Pauline epistles. We kind of generally accept Paul wrote them, but a lot of scholars would argue that he only wrote, I think it's 7 of them. I think it's 7 that they generally, 7 or 8. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I tend to think in terms of ones that people don't accept. So, and then you can do what's left. But the ones that are usually in dispute are Ephesians, Colossians, Second Thessalonians, and then the 3 pastorals: First Timothy, Second Timothy, and Titus. That's 6. And then Hebrews would be 7. But as I said, there's sort of very few who would defend Pauline authorship of Ephesians. So I mean of Hebrews. So those would be those 6 that would be in question.
Mm-hmm. Why would those be in question?
Yeah, and the arguments tend to be related to vocabulary, issues that don't readily come out in English, but then also historicity. So let me try to explain. So say, for example, in Ephesians, right? If you look at the book of Acts, Paul spent a good deal of time in Ephesus. And when he left, in fact, there's a very poignant of him leaving Ephesus and a very tearful farewell. If you look at the book of Ephesians, there's some textual issues. One is the wording at the beginning in Ephesus is not present in some of the ancient manuscripts. So there's question mark over who were the readers. And then at the end, when we're used to Paul giving what we might call the shout outs at the end of the letter, greet so and so, greet so and so. There's none of that at the end of Ephesians, which strikes one as odd, considering he spent so much time there and had such a tearful farewell. Why doesn't he say hello to anybody in Ephesus? So it raises those kinds of questions. That's sort of a historical kind of a question. Also, some of the theology of Ephesians seems at times a little different than other parts of Paul. For example, when we read about salvation seems to be something in the future. In Ephesians, it's happened already. You have been saved. There's a very, what some people might call a realized eschatology in Ephesians. There seems to be, we're already seated in the heavenly places. So that's a kind of a development of Pauline thought that they didn't see in some of the other letters. So that's the kind of argument that's made. And then from a vocabulary standpoint, you see words that Paul, that we don't often see in some of his other writings that are not debated, like Romans or Philippians, like that. Some of that might be a subjective argument, I mean, how do we account for somebody's choice of vocabulary or their writing style? I mean, static, so it's somewhat of a subjective question as to writing style. Also, there may, if Paul's in prison dictating letters to someone, it's very possible that the scribe, there's a technical name for this, an amanuensis, but that a scribe is writing what Paul is talking about. So one could argue that stylistic differences are present because the actual pen is being guided by somebody else, explain that. But the issues come up because of style, theology. That last part of historicity is particularly relevant with the pastorals because Luke ends with Paul in prison, and you get the impression that he's going to just die there. It's left with him in a Roman prison, rest, and Luke ends Acts with that kind of picture of Paul. But if the pastorals were written by Paul, he would have had to make a fourth missionary journey, which is not recorded in Acts, and that that has to be negotiated. Sometimes in your Bibles, where you open up and you see those maps in there, and they've got Paul, you'll see sometimes a fourth journey because it has to be theorized or hypothesized, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the issues. It's how do I reconcile these writings with that? Lastly, I'll say with the pastorals, you also get a sense of the development of the church in a way that you don't necessarily see in other letters. Paul has got leaders in these churches for sure. Pastorals sense that time's going to wrap up pretty soon.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is going to come again. But then in the pastorals, you now have a formula for the propagation of the church, how to select leaders, how to select what we might call bishops and deacons, and there's more of a sense of an infrastructure. Like this is going to live on for a while, which seems for some people to be at odds with Paul's kind of quick thrust, like you see in a First Thessalonians, thought to be his first letter. So those are the kinds of issues that need to be negotiated. I'm not saying there aren't answers to them, but I am saying they spark questions for us, and the careful reader will acknowledge that if I'm reading Second Timothy, or rather not Second, but First Timothy and Titus, how did Paul, when did he write that? So those are the kind of questions. They get answered in some good books. I'll make another reference to the New Testament introduction, co-authored by D.A. Carson and Doug Moo. That's out the circles for a while. And they sort of make an apologetic for the earlier dating of letters and for Pauline authorship.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good resource to explore that more.
How do you reconcile that personally? You don't have to give a whole spiel on it. Just one way folks can reconcile one of the books, one of the pastoral epistles.
Yeah, for example, Second Timothy, there's a growing number of scholars who are willing to see that as Pauline. It does reflect Paul's thinking in some ways. I mean, and then also, as I was suggesting earlier, it's fair to give somebody space to develop their thought over time.
Mm-hmm.
So if Second Timothy is reflecting the end of Paul's life, which it sounds like, and his impending martyrdom, I fought a good fight, I kept the faith. Sure, developed some thoughts about the faith from those early days in the 40s when he was, just starting out and sending letters back. So for me, I reconcile the theological points by saying, surely that could have developed over time. We're talking 20 years. My own theological thoughts have developed over time, and for sure. So the pragmatic parts, I think, we're able to reconcile that. I think I've already addressed the grammatical things. I think that can be that's somewhat subjective. I think we don't have to see different hands just because some language and grammar changes.
Mm-hmm.
And then for me, I also reconcile by in my mind by thinking that we have that there could be that amanuensis who's writing, with Paul's to be writing his thoughts in essence.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of it. I confess though, I still have some struggles with other books like Second Peter, but fitting that in. Although I'm aware of some of the arguments, but you asked about Paul in particular, but that's how I'm dealing with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's my next question. The authorship of John's letters and Peter's letters being that question, and what are the questions and how do we reconcile those? So you led into my
Sure.
next question.
Oh, that's fine. Well, good. It's interesting. Second Peter, Jude, Second and Third John, Hebrews. They were among um, the late acceptance into the canon, if you will. They were the ones that kind of probably a while wrestling over those. The issue with Second Peter, this notion of contending for a faith that seems to have been around for a long time at this point. You know, your verse for Jude 3, that contending for the faith that was once delivered to the saints. For some people, that feels like this has been around for a long time now. We're looking back on something. Mm-hmm. That's just one. But also, the use
Dr. Edwards, one moment. I think your connection went out. Oh, it's okay. It's back now.
Yeah. So there's the question of basically the timing of Second Peter and Jude. Do they reflect later concerns? And then, if we know that Peter's martyred by Nero in the 60s, are those concerns really that early on in the 60s? So that's part of the pressure. I'll not address the stylistic concerns. There's a few with First Peter, even that it's a pretty sophisticated writing, and some people think, well, Peter's this uneducated fisherman from Galilee. How does he write something so relatively sophisticated, And those arguments are, again, subjective. We don't know fully what his education would have been like and how much he would have been exposed to Greek writing and style. So it's an open question in that regard. But the Second Peter Jude question does have to be considered in terms of, were these theological ideas present earlier than we may have thought?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you said you wrestled through the Second Peter one, and I know you just wrote a commentary on Peter, but yours was First Peter, right?
On First Peter, right. And there, I did have to defend a bit of Peter's authorship because I felt it was easier there. I mean, in some ways, the challenges to Petrine authorship of First Peter I don't think are as stark as Second Peter. Mm-hmm. So, and I mentioned earlier, some of this notion that he could not have written something so sophisticated. But with Second Peter, the challenge is I think a little harder because of the theological ideas present.
Mm-hmm. What theological ideas?
Yeah. Now, Peter and and Jude both get at these heresies that have crept in. In fact, their language is very similar, and the themes you could line them up next to each other and see the flow of their argument against the heretics. Mm-hmm. Is very similar in both books. Mm-hmm. But as I'm suggesting, those ideas, were they late or not? And so some scholars think those heretical ideas were creeping in late, particularly what's mentioned, and without reading the text, one could look. But Second Peter's got 3 chapters, Jude just the 1. But you can see the themes even come in roughly the same order. Books seem to refer to apocryphal writings, to First Enoch, to the Testament of Moses, books that we don't have as canon. But the fact that they were in their worldview, they were in the air, also could suggest time has gone by. Mm-hmm. So that's what makes it difficult.
Mm-hmm. And it's so funny that you mentioned the Enoch reference in Jude, because I get people all the time wanting to read Enoch because of the Jude reference, and kind of just reading through that as a way to, I guess, exposure. I think it's good, because it's referenced in Jude, and I see why people would want to read it for that reason. what do we do when we're kind of encountering people who say, well, what about the Jude passage when we talk about canonization?
Hmm.
And it's put in there and say we agree on this, we agree on the 66 books, but then we have a reference to a book that we wouldn't consider to be in the canon.
Yeah, that's a fair question. In fact, it just came up in I'm teaching a New Testament survey course right now, Bethel, and it just came up. This is pretty relevant for me. Well, one student, I think, did a really good job of answering that question. And if I can remember part of his answer, is he acknowledged that, he put it this way. He said, these writings were in the air. And I think that's a fair way to say it. It's that it's in their worldview. I
Mm-hmm.
think he also acknowledged that, Paul is known to quote secular poet and philosopher in his writings, or at least as Luke is telling us about Paul in Acts. And so Paul seems to also pull in, let's say, secular writers to make a case without necessarily canonizing those authors or their writings in any way, but he uses it to make his case. One could argue that that's always what's being done. People bring in information to make their case. I would say even with the book of Genesis going on, we have an ancient cosmology at work that the writer of Genesis is relying on to tell that story. So it's not that the materials used to tell the story have to in themselves be canonical, but they can be used to make a case for what is birthed by the Spirit of God to be God's eternal word. So yeah, so I think that's probably the best way for me to say it.
I think that's a good kind of response, because it's kind of like doing a research paper. You're going to pull in things that you wouldn't think are, are maybe the best representation of maybe your thoughts at your conclusions, but you're going to pull in that to kind of support the conclusion you're drawing. So
that's probably a good analogy. Yeah.
My last question would be, so one of the questions we get a lot is about the Gnostic Gospels. People are thinking that, they were excluded because they're more liberating in some ways. Some people have used that term. It's kind of like but the early church fathers and the councils conspired because they wanted to have a certain view pushed. So they excluded certain passages because they were trying to push a certain viewpoint on people to further oppress them, or there's different reasons people feel this way.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's fair. I think it's really hard for me to the motives of anybody. I really don't know, and I try to be fair-minded about people who seem to be seeking the truth. Yet at the same time, I don't want to be naive. For sure, there are ways that throughout history, the church, with a capital C, I guess, has not been, as fair-minded all the time as it could be. But my sense is that I tried to be respectful of the forebears, that they were really honestly trying to safeguard what we call the regular fide, the rule of faith. They were trying to safeguard, just like Jude 3, the faith that had been handed down to them. So when later documents start to come in that challenge that and are born out of a different, they saw a responsibility to not include those because it didn't jibe with the rule of faith. So in that sense, they were gatekeepers in a sense of trying to safeguard. So I see that as a noble calling. I'm kind of glad I wasn't part of it, because I think that would be tough, and we do tend to politicize things. So I just honestly don't know how political it was. I try to give the benefit of the doubt to the forebears that they were seeking to keep the faith accurate and consistent. I would say the Gnostic Gospels do present a different picture of God, a different picture of Jesus, but everyone would agree that that is a later picture. That is a later development. So I think one of the things we're also looking at is not only what are the letters saying, but that's why the early, I mean, the dating part, as your first question gets at, is relevant because earlier would suggest closer to the actual events and the earlier formation theological ideas as they come through the Lord Himself and come through people like Paul and others. So the fact that we have documents that I would say are at the very least, let's to be fair, are in the first century would represent the I think a more accurate interpretation and understanding of things as opposed to documents that are dated later and we would agree are dated later. Say for example, the Gospel of Thomas couldn't have been written by Thomas. Nobody would even argue that. So the questions would be what ideas are present there, and if they're later ideas, why should we accept them, especially when they veer from what we already know that churches believed and practiced.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully I'm answering that question.
Yeah, because that does bring the conversation kind of back full circle, because when we think about when there's, we're talking through an apologetic approach to defending the faith, and, we'll talk about, well, how do we know that these texts are reliable? We will point to either authorship by an apostle or close tie to an apostle, written close to the time that Jesus was there, trusted by the first century church as authoritative. Those kinds of things are, the criteria for canonicity. But then when you start dating the Pauline epistles and other epistles later, and then if you can't find a connection to Paul, then you run into the same issues that you would have with the Gnostic Gospels. A later dating, no kind of connection to an apostle in a sense. And so I think that's why, going back to the first question, the authorship and the dating becomes important, because then how can we differentiate between the criteria for the New Testament, books and Gnostic books, besides the thought pattern in that.
No, you frame well, some of the issues that are at stake. I would say even still, that connection to the apostles, I don't know what the connection needs to be, but that was a criteria. I mean, for example, we don't know who wrote Matthew, as I said earlier, or Mark for that matter, although there's a strong tradition that's connected to it. But the fact that they seem to be really closely connected to the apostles helps to make the case that you're just now making, that it's earlier, more consistent with what the church believes, or I should say more consistent with what the church believed and practiced, and close to the time of Jesus. It just helps if we know who the person was, because we can put them in history. In those cases where, it does help. So that's why the question comes up, though, when we have a name and we're not drunk in terms of the timing, that's when it becomes difficult. We don't, so but you're right, it frames the argument. If it was really late, though, I don't think anybody would argue for a very late time, even for the pastorals, but some try to creep those books into the early second century. And then you're right, then do they challenge Gnostic ideas or buy into them? I think we could still argue that they challenge the growing Gnostic ideas, which would still be in line with the faith that was once delivered to the church. So I would say you're right in that there's a theological integrity that the early church was going for.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I think this has been a very rich conversation. Is there any other resources that you would recommend that you haven't already mentioned?
There are some good New Testament introductions out there that'll give you this lay of the land in more detail. I've already mentioned Carson Moo, mentioned Metzger on the canon. I mentioned F.F. Bruce on the canon. There's a New Testament introduction that's, I think, quite accessible by Mark Allen Powell called Introducing the New Testament, Mark Allen Powell. And and then there's, of course, the writings of the New Testament by Luke Timothy Johnson. So you'll get a lay of the land on these things. And I think, like you said at the beginning, this sense of intellectual honesty and wrestling with things, I think that's good for, especially for those of us who might bear the title evangelical in some sense of that word. We want to be fair to the data, and not just take, a viewpoint hook, line, and sinker. So those are good resources, I think, that allow us to make educated, credible decisions and not throw out babies with bathwater.
Yes. And how can people get in contact with you?
Sure. I think one way to find me easily is Facebook. I'm, it's Facebook.com/Rev Dr. Dre. And that's also my handle on Twitter, Rev Dr. Dre, REVDRDRE. And I'm also, as I mentioned, the senior pastor of the Sanctuary Covenant Church. So sanctuarycov.org is our website, and you can find my email there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate your work. God bless you.